This is an introduction to triangle congruence. We can show that two triangles are congruent to each other, that is, they have exactly the same size and same shape, by showing that all of their corresponding sides and all of their corresponding angles are congruent. So in the diagram below, we know that triangle BAC is congruent to triangle JHK because the corresponding sides and angles are marked as congruent to each other. Let's take a look at this diagram. So notice that angle B has this one little pink arc, as does angle J in this lower triangle. That means that those two angles are congruent to each other. In the same way, A has two little arcs, as does angle H, so those two angles are congruent to each other, and K and C are congruent to each other. Let's take a look at the sides. Side BA has one little pink mark on it, as does side HJ. That means that those two sides are congruent, they have the same length. So too are BC and KJ congruent to each other, and AC and KH. So, since we know that all of the corresponding sides and all of the corresponding angles are congruent to each other, then we can say that triangle BAC is congruent to triangle JHK. The converse of this is also true. If we know that the two triangles are congruent to each other, then we know that all of their corresponding angles and sides are also congruent to each other. So, if triangle BAC is congruent to triangle JHK, then angle B is congruent to J, angle A is congruent to angle H, and so on with the rest of the angles and sides. You get the idea. This theorem is abbreviated Cpctc. That is, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. If we know that the two triangles are congruent, all of their corresponding parts, that is, sides and angles, are congruent. If we know that all of their parts are congruent, all their sides and angles are congruent, then we know the two triangles are congruent. As you will see in the Unit 2 investigation, there are shortcuts to proving triangle congruence. We don't need to show every time that all three corresponding angles are congruent and all three corresponding sides are congruent. But before we do that, we need to define a few terms, and those are included angles and included sides. An included angle is the angle that's formed by two adjacent sides. So in triangle ABC below, angle B is the included angle between sides AB and BC, because sides AB and BC form angle B. So B is the included angle between those two sides. An included side is the side that's located between two consecutive angles. Again, in this triangle, side BC would be the included side between angle B and angle C. So in this video, we took a look at an introduction to triangle congruence, and we're able to show that two triangles are congruent if we show that all of their corresponding parts, their sides and angles, are congruent to each other, as well as the converse of that. If corresponding parts of two triangles are congruent to each other, then the triangles are congruent. We call this Cpctc, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Make sure that that definition is in your math notebook.